Behind the Iron Curtain, there was social unrest in a country by the name of Poland. The people were always hungry and tired of communism, so they took action. On the 14th of August 1980, strikers in the port of Gdańsk united, soon to be brought together under the name Solidarność. That day, 21 demands were posted in the Lenin shipyard, the most important being, quote, recognition of the free trade union, independent of the party and employers, based on Convention 87 of the International Labor Organization, end quote. Had it not been for the diplomatic fight and debates Solidarity had with the government, the world, and especially Eastern Europe, would be in a different place right now. Solidarity was the reason communism fell in Poland, because they organized anti-communist strikes, they were persistent despite the government's efforts to end the union, and they debated with the government in the roundtable talks. Shortly after the strike in the Lenin shipyard, an agreement was reached between the communist government and the strike leader Lech Wałęsa. This was called the Gdańsk Accord. On the first page, the accord pledged to, quote, guarantee and ensure complete respect for the independence and self-government of the new trade unions, end quote.
Mamy wreszcie niezależne, samorządne związki zawodowe. Mamy prawo do strajku.
This first victory for Solidarity was an incredibly important one. An independent trade union behind the Iron Curtain was unheard of. With a name for the people to unite under, the Polish public was able to achieve so much, and this was an incredibly important first step. Solidarity gave the already angry public power, and at its peak had 10 million members, which was half the Polish adult population at the time. The sheer power of the public and workers allowed them to strike and force the communist government to give them work improvements, like raises in pay and better working conditions. Improvements like these showed the public that it was possible to make changes and eventually rid the Soviets from their land. After many strikes, the government needed another way to control the public. So on December 13, 1981, martial law was imposed on the Polish people by General Wojciech Jaruzelski. The government's primary goal in imposing martial law was to deter Solidarity and having gatherings, including strikes and protests. General Jaruzelski began his crackdown on Solidarity, arresting tens of thousands of Solidarity members, including Wałęsa, the leader of the strikes. He put tanks in the streets, and Zomo riot police towered over the public. A Washington Post article from November 10, 1982, described the Zomo as, quote, the most feared and certainly the most hated, end quote. They, quote, stormed factories occupied by striking workers and broke up demonstrations in support of the independent Solidarity trade union, end quote. One of the largest protests during this era took place at the Wujek coal mine on December 16, 1981. Zomo riot police opened fire on the protesters, killing 9 and injuring 22. In the midst of all this, Solidarity persisted, despite the government's efforts. Their perseverance through death and pain ultimately resulted in martial law being formally lifted in July 1983. Though martial law was lifted, Solidarity was still delegalized, so it was hard to organize strikes and protests. Organizers still did not give up and used leaflets to communicate with the people. The public pressed on, and every time they walked out, the strike leaders were able to debate with officials and make minor concessions. Once again, showing perseverance. They weren't getting anything big, and most of the time the government wouldn't keep its promise. Through 1983 to 1988, the public kept putting consistent pressure on the government. Solidarity had support from the likes of the Catholic Church and the Pope, to the CIA and Ronald Reagan. The movement never stopped. In the summer of 1988, quote, strikes took place in at least 27 businesses, employing a total of almost 200,000 people, end quote. These strikes were all major blows to the Communist Party. They could not live with this kind of work stoppage. During the strikes, the government did anything it could to stop this social unrest, from having secret meetings with Wałęsa to televised debates with him. On November 30th of 1988, Lech Wałęsa won a televised debate with the head of the regime trade union headquarters, Alfred Miodowicz. This victory was something that the government and Alfred Miodowicz did not expect, as the reason they entertained this debate was so that they could back Wałęsa into a corner and prove Solidarity wrong. Wałęsa valiantly forged ahead, risking losing the public. He prevailed. Wałęsa gave a speech to the country on February 6, 1989, where he proclaimed that the whole system is broken, that the people at fault are the PZPR, meaning the Communist Party. Quote, "We know the country is ruined," end quote, Wałęsa said in a speech televised to millions. When Wałęsa said this in front of the country, there was no going back. Solidarity would have to be arguing for major change, not just for the legalization of its union, but systematic change for Poland. Quote, "There is only one direction. It has to lead to a democratic system," end quote. Here he proclaimed that there was not going to be any sort of decision made on the Solidarity side to keep the communist system in power. It proved Solidarity wanted to make big systematic change, which would eventually end communism in Poland. The roundtable talks were debates that were held from February 6, 1989 to April 5, 1989. The talks were between the communist government and Solidarity. The main goal was to create an agreement and make concessions about the future of the nation. During the roundtable talks, Lech Wałęsa and the PZPR were able to come up with the Reform Pact. And on April 4th of 1989, the Reform Pact was signed. Lech Wałęsa said after the agreement was signed that, quote, "The agreement signaled Poland's first lesson in democracy," end quote. The agreement included major reforms, those being independent trade unions were to be legalized, including Solidarity, which was banned in 1982. The Senate was to be formed as the high chamber of the Polish parliament. The office of the president, elected by a bicameral parliament, was to be introduced instead of a Communist Party general secretary. A semi-free election was to be organized, with 65% of the seats in the same, lower chamber, granted to PZPR, but a free election for the Senate. It's important to note that the 65% PZPR seats were subject to change after the first elections. An article written by Ian Trainer of The Guardian in 1989 stated that, quote, "Polish society wanted the organs of the state modeled in such a way as to secure pluralism and differences that represent a true image of a nation," end quote. This agreement allowed them to do just that. It gave more voting power to Polish people than they had originally, and their ability to have complete control over the Senate seats with just their vote meant that pro-communist leaders could be voted out in favor of more progressive ones. The public eventually voted out communist politicians from the Sejm, and that showed how powerful democracy could be. The more social part of the agreement included permission to a free newspaper and radio for Solidarity, allowing them to give real information, free of propaganda, to people. Previously, as a citizen in Poland, it would be hard to be informed on what is happening in the country and abroad. But this new source of information changed that, and all the Polish public could listen to propaganda-free news. On the 22nd of December 1990, Lech Wałęsa was sworn in as the first elected president of Poland since the Warsaw Pact. From an electrician, to a leader of strikes, to a leader of a movement, to the leader of a country as president, Lech Wałęsa accomplished so much. A quote that encapsulates just the feat that Lech Wałęsa and Solidarity had accomplished over these past years is, quote, "We came to the round table from prison, under the truncheons of the Zomor riot police," end quote. Wałęsa once said this in a speech televised live to the country. Solidarity persevered through many setbacks and death to debate with the government and achieve the signing of the Reform Pact, the most crucial document in post-World War II Polish history. Lech Wałęsa and Solidarity did it, from the strikes in Gdańsk to the signing of the Reform Pact. It was a long road, but they did it. The end of communism in Poland. On November 9th, 1989, months after Poland signed the Reform Pact, the Berlin Wall collapsed, starting the fall of the Soviet Union. A couple years later, the USSR and the Iron Curtain fell in late December of 1991. It was a glorious victory for the whole world.